So when we were last discussing this, we had talked about the incident in Little Rock and the integration of Little Rock Central High using the 101st Airborne. We talked about the Civil Rights Act of 1957 designed to protect voting rights. Now let's look at how the civil rights movement kind of expanded from this point. It famously expanded through the sit-in movement. Now, we've already talked about sit-ins, previously. We talked about CORE's use of the sit-in tactic to integrate places that had de facto, again, de facto meaning it wasn't the law, it was just understood custom in an area, de facto segregation. Well, now we're going to see an effort by young African American, primarily male college students, not exclusively, but primarily male college students, to practice sit-in protests in the South where segregation is actually the law, where Jim Crow law exists and segregation is an actual, crime or law that will be upheld, and what they're doing is a crime. Sorry, I struggled on coming up with the way to say that. You know, if you go into the quote unquote white part of town in Denver, Colorado, you haven't committed a crime. I mean, they can't arrest you for being, black in the white part of town, if you will, right? You're going to catch some racial slurs. You're going to catch some grief from the cops, but you can't actually be arrested. In the Deep South, you're going to be arrested. You've committed a crime. But what you're going to see is a number of young African American students are going to begin doing this. It all started when 4 students went into the Woolworth, which was a department store that had like a lunch counter or a place where you could grab food. Kind of like how Targets nowadays have a Starbucks or whatever. Woolworths had actually a little counter where you could get a meal. And these 4 college students in Greensboro, North Carolina, who were all students at the nearby North Carolina Ag and Tech College, they went in, they sat down, and they tried to order food. And they refused to leave until they were served. It started out with 4 students, but next thing you know, guess what? Their friends started to do it. And these people, they took a beating. And I do mean they took a beating. Not only were they arrested, but before the cops got there, people were throwing coffee on them. People were spitting on them. A couple of them got thrown to the floor. Things of that nature, right? Maybe not the first 4 necessarily, but as this started to spread, you did have violence. You had violent response from whites in the South to some of this. I will say that within a couple months of starting the sit-in movement, you had 54 cities in 9 states which saw sit-in protests. They did it at stores, restaurants, hotels, movie theaters. By 1961, over 100 cities had seen sit-in protests. Now, the sit-in movement energized and brought in a whole new crop of civil rights activists. Previously it had primarily been the work of King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, right? The SCLC, the churches and the church leaders. But what you suddenly saw were a bunch of these young college kids kind of break away and doing their own thing. This was their way to get involved, right? Like Jesse Jackson, young African-American leader who actually ran for president a couple times in the 1980s. I remember him from when I was a kid. Now, if you are the NAACP or the SCLC, you are very, very worried because these kids are walking into basically violent situations. And you're asking a 20-something, young 19, 20, 21-year-old African-American male to take a beating and to quietly take a beating. You're asking them to not lash back in any way. You're asking them to sit there. You're asking them to take hot coffee being thrown at them, people sticking cigarettes in their neck, people hitting them, spitting on them, calling them everything under the sun, and they can't react. I'm not saying it can't be done, but you can see why everybody was like, this is going to go badly, because you all are young males, and I'm pretty sure you all would struggle to sit there and silently take that kind of abuse. They're human beings too. And that was the concern. All you need is one kid to what? Throw a punch and knock out some guy's teeth, and it's game over, right? All that work that Dr. King had done with nonviolent protests goes out the window. But they did it. They kept doing it. And as the sit-in movement spread and became successful, Ella Baker, who was the executive director of the SCLC, she basically invited these students to kind of join the SCLC, and they were like, "No, we want to do our own thing." She said, "Okay, fine. Let's create an organization for students." Thus was created the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. SNCC basically became the civil rights organization for African American college students to join and participate in, and also actually everyone. It wasn't just African American. The civil rights movement was open to anybody. So if you were a white college student who wanted to fight for civil rights, you could join SNCC. Now, they were, of course, focused on desegregating public facilities. We've already won the court case over schools. Now we've got to get, them to desegregate all of society, right? Because just like how Southerners had fought tooth and nail to not desegregate their schools, right? How they took their time and how they fought tooth and nail and they argued. They were doing that with everything. And so the SNCC and their sit-in protest and et cetera were all designed to try and get people to finally, break down the walls of segregation. Now, another big thing that SNCC wanted to do was to help get people registered to vote. Remember, the Civil Rights Act of '57 was focused on getting the right to vote protected. And the SCLC had talked about a voter registration drive. Well, SNCC said that's right up our alley. We're going to get kids to go get people registered to vote, but we're going to go to the rural South. It's easy to do this stuff in the cities. You go door to door. You go to the quote unquote black part of town and you ring doorbells, you knock on doors, and you introduce yourself and you help people fill out the forms and you're done. But they said, what about the people who live in nowhere, Mississippi? What about the people who live in rural, southern Alabama? Who's going to get them registered to vote? Who's going to reach out to them? And so you had a lot of these kids in SNCC who said, yep, we'll go do that. And they started going into these rural areas. It was dangerous work. For example, these three college kids were murdered in Mississippi, if I remember, as they were trying to register African American voters in rural parts of Mississippi. They were murdered one night by the KKK with the help of the local sheriff. The local sheriff set them up. I don't need to get into all the details, but basically they got pulled over. The sheriff pulled them over in a very specific spot because that's where the KKK was waiting to ambush them, and they were basically murdered, lynched, and left in the woods. I also have a burning Mississippi. Or Mississippi burning, as people call it. There will be a number of church bombings that will take place, and just arson in general, in Mississippi in 1964, the same summer that these three young men were murdered. Now, another example, though, of this movement spreading out, right, branching out, kind of hitting things in different ways. The Freedom Riders. Who were the Freedom Riders? The Freedom Riders were groups of both white and black Americans who were determined to integrate interstate bus travel. Some of you might remember that interstate bus travel was supposed to be integrated after a court ruling years ago. If you remember, Morgan v. Virginia, 1946, ruled that interstate bus travel could not be segregated. But many southern states were still practicing this. They were still segregating buses that would cross state lines. And I mean, here we are now that Brown v. Board has been issued, you can't segregate a bus anyhow. I don't care if it's interstate or intrastate. But many states were, and so what you had were groups of African American and whites who volunteered to ride buses that they would, of course, have integrated and go to these towns where they were still segregating the buses and basically go get attacked, go get beat up, go get arrested, bring attention to the fact that these southern states and southern cities were ignoring court orders. In early May of 1961, when they rode into Anniston and Birmingham and Montgomery, Alabama, they were attacked by white mobs. In Anniston, someone threw basically a homemade Molotov cocktail firebomb into the bus. Luckily, no one was killed, but the bus was burned. When they rode into Birmingham, they were met by a mob that was armed and viciously beat them, right? Viciously beat them. When people asked, how does a mob armed with bats, pipes, chains, how does a mob like that gather at a bus terminal in broad daylight and there's not a cop there to stop them or break them up or divert the bus or anything? The local police chief, public safety commissioner, named Theophilus Bull Connor, He said, well, it was Mother's Day, and I gave a lot of my officers the morning off so they could have, breakfast or brunch or go to church with their mother or whatever. Um, the FBI later found that actually Bull Connor had contacted the local KKK and, gave them the green light and told his officers, stay away. We're going to teach them Freedom Riders a lesson. I like to point out, police chief set him up, right? Of a large southern city, police chief set the Freedom Riders up for an ambush by the KKK. Now, this, of course, was becoming national news. And I want to point out, this is all taking place hot on the heels of the election of John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy was elected in the 1960 presidential election, one of the tightest elections in American history, gentlemen. And he had campaigned on a pro-civil rights stance, right? John F. Kennedy versus Richard Nixon in 1960. I'm not saying that Richard Nixon did not support civil rights, but John F. Kennedy went all in on it, right? He really made it a part of his campaign platform and part of his messaging. He had campaigned on civil rights. He promised to expand civil rights if elected. His brother, Bobby Kennedy, or Robert Kennedy, had helped get Martin Luther King Jr. released from jail in Georgia at one point after he got arrested at a protest. He barely won the election, right? If you studied election 1960, you're talking a couple states decided by a couple of votes, a couple thousand votes. And let's be honest, the civil rights aspect might have won him those states, right? It might have given him just enough votes, especially in like Illinois, right? A northern state where African Americans could vote, right? But when he got into office, he was very timid. He was very slow. Much like Dwight Eisenhower, he seemed very cautious, and many African Americans were upset. Why was he timid? He needs Southern Democratic senators to support his New Frontier, which was his platform, right? Franklin Roosevelt had the New Deal. Woodrow Wilson had New Freedom. John F. Kennedy had the New Frontier, right? And he had all these things he wanted to do. But the only way you're going to get any of that passed if you're a Democratic president is if Democratic senators support you. And, well, it just turns out almost every senator from the South is a Democrat. So John F. Kennedy talked a big game when he ran for president. But when he became president, he was very cautious. I will say he did, as I have up here, he did name African Americans to various positions in his administration. He did create the Committee on Equal Employment Opportunity to stop discrimination in the hiring practice of the federal bureaucracy. But that was about it. He actually let his brother Bobby do the talking. His brother Bobby was appointed Attorney General, which means his brother Bobby is in charge of the Justice Department and the FBI. And so John F. Kennedy didn't do a whole lot of work. He let his brother and the Justice Department do a lot of the work. In part because if you think about it, that's good politics. Bobby Kennedy doesn't have a choice. If someone files a lawsuit, the Justice Department has to pursue it. If someone contacts the FBI, the Justice Department has to do it, right? And that's in part why John F. Kennedy kind of let his brother take the lead, right? And remember, this was all done by Eisenhower. So there's a civil rights division. It's there. It has a job involving civil rights. All of this stuff was already there. So that's the other thing. John F. Kennedy didn't have to create anything. John F. Kennedy just said, okay, we're gonna use what Eisenhower made. And Bobby, you're gonna do it, and then nobody can blame me because I can just, if anybody complains, I'll be like, I can't tell Bobby not to. He's in charge of the Justice Department. Anyhow, when there was violence against the Freedom Riders, the Kennedys reluctantly came to their aid. You see, what happened was the Freedom Riders started doing all of their protests, not only right after the election of John F. Kennedy, but Nikita Khrushchev, who you might remember from our coverage of Cold War, chapter 26. He actually came up at the very end of our Cold War discussion, 26.4. Nikita Khrushchev had just come to power. Well, had not just come to power. He'd been in power a couple years. But he had a meeting planned. He was going to have a meeting with John F. Kennedy. He was coming to the United States of America to meet with the newly elected president, John F. Kennedy. And John F. Kennedy was deathly afraid that while Nikita Khrushchev was in town, was in the country, that there would be all this violence that would be front page news, right? And he did not want the leader of the Soviet Union to be able to throw a newspaper in his lap with pictures of African Americans getting brutally beat up by the cops. And so Bobby Kennedy made a deal with Mississippi. Bobby Kennedy basically called up the leading senator in Mississippi and said, look, when the Freedom Riders come in, you can arrest them. We won't take you to court. There will be no court injunctions. There'll be none of the usual stuff. We're going to quietly let you arrest them. You can't. You really shouldn't be able to arrest them. You're breaking the law when you arrest them. But I'm going to let you arrest them as long as nobody gets hurt. They get quietly arrested. Nobody gets beat up, nobody gets hurt, and nobody will get in trouble for it, right? You'll get away with breaking the law. And Senator Eastland of Mississippi was like, that sounds good. And so they did the deal. When the riders pulled into Jackson, Mississippi, they were quietly arrested by local police. And it looked like, well, that's all she wrote. Well, in order to get the Freedom Riders out of jail, they basically used all the money that CORE had. CORE had been helping fund the Freedom Rides. CORE had to basically use all the money it had to bail the Freedom Riders out of jail from this incident. And it looks like the Freedom Rides are over because you still need money to rent buses. That's when Thurgood Marshall, you remember Thurgood Marshall, the lawyer who had argued the Brown v. Board case. Thurgood Marshall, gentlemen, called up his old friend James Farmer at the NAACP, or excuse me, he called up James Farmer, a leader of CORE, and he said, look, the NAACP has a bunch of money in a special fund. Why don't you guys use that? I'm sure you guys can work out a deal. And they did. And the Freedom Riders kept going. After President Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev got done with their meeting, and I don't know why I said Nikita Khrushchev was coming. Nikita Khrushchev came when Eisenhower was president. John F. Kennedy went to meet with Nikita Khrushchev over in Europe. Anyhow, when Kennedy came home, he found out the Freedom Riders were doing their thing, right? The Freedom Riders are still running around doing all this stuff. Kennedy thought he had come up with a solution. He did not. And so finally, Kennedy has to act. He realizes that we cannot continuously have these poor unarmed people getting beat up every time they go into a bus terminal. And so Kennedy told his brother, get on it. His brother, Bobby, ordered the Justice Department to basically issue court rulings against the cities. And they also pointed out that these cities were violating ICC regulations, and so they could be sued and a whole bunch of other stuff. And by late 1962, the segregation of interstate bus travel had basically come to an end. And again, it was thanks to these people basically voluntarily riding into really violent situations, volunteering to get really badly hurt so that people would notice what was going on. Now, while the Freedom Riders were doing their thing, another bit of history was about to take place. On the very day that John F. Kennedy was sworn in as President of the United States, an African American, who actually was a veteran of the United States Air Force, a guy by the name of James Meredith, applied to transfer to attend the University of Mississippi, Ole Miss. Up until that point, the university had made no effort whatsoever to integrate or desegregate the University of Mississippi. But James Meredith wanted to get his degree from Ole Miss, so he applied to attend. In September, when he actually went to register for classes at the admissions office, the registrar's office, he found the door to the very office he needed to go into was blocked by the governor of Mississippi himself, Mr. Ross Barnett. Meredith had a court order, a federal court order, that was to guarantee his registration. And when he told, the governor that he had a court order, the governor said, never, we will never surrender to the evil and illegal forces of tyranny. The very next day, John F. Kennedy sent 500 federal marshals to escort James Meredith back onto the campus so he could get registered. Shortly after they all arrived, there was a full-scale riot. People threw rocks, bottles, bricks. Some people broke into the school's chemistry lab and got jars of acid and began throwing it at the marshals and James Meredith. There were a few shotguns fired from long distance at them. The marshals were armed with tear gas and pepper spray, that sort of stuff. but they were not actually provided any real firearms to fire back on the crowd with, because we wanted to avoid one of those kind of collisions. Um, the campus turned into just a full scale battlefield. By the morning, 160 marshals had been wounded to various degrees, and so Kennedy ordered several thousand soldiers to the campus, and for the rest of the year, Mr. James Meredith attended the University of Mississippi under federal guard. He graduated the following year with a degree from Ole Miss, the first African American to do so. And so, yet again, we have a Southern educational institution integrated by the use of federal armed force, because another governor refuses to bow to federal court orders. Now, the James Meredith situation made King realize something. Okay, we're getting to the fight in Birmingham. The government only responds when there's violence, right? The government only gets involved when people get really badly hurt, when there's a riot, right? They think about it. Little Rock, Central High, you need a riot. Freedom Riders, you need just beat downs on the front page of the newspaper. James Meredith. It seems like the government's not really willing to step in until they absolutely have to, and violence is when they absolutely have to. And so King decided they needed to go where they were guaranteed to get some violence. Birmingham, right? The police chief, the commissioner of public safety, Theophilus Eugene Bull Connor, is an outspoken, rabid, racist, and segregationist. Um, and basically, King decided we're going to go there and we're going to push his buttons. I know this guy will come unhinged. And so King announced that there was going to be a series of peaceful protests in Birmingham, calling for civil rights and voting rights, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, at this point, Bull Connor was he was running for mayor. He was actually running for mayor that fall in the election. Not long after the protest began, King was arrested and locked up in solitary confinement for, I can't remember what charge, but it was loitering. I mean, it was something ridiculous, right? While in jail in Birmingham, he wrote what is famously known as Letter from a Birmingham Jail on scraps of paper that visitors smuggled to him, and using like a little nub of a pencil. Letter from a Birmingham Jail is considered one of the greatest defenses of nonviolent protest ever written. I mean, it is an eloquent piece of work. The thought that a man wrote this on basically post-it notes in a jailhouse using, a little nubby pencil from Putt Putt is quite impressive. Eventually, gentlemen, and if you'd like to know a little bit more about it, I guess I'll, he explained nonviolent protest is about abiding by the higher law, the moral law. He basically said there are unjust laws in this world, and we have a duty to stand up against them, to fight for the moral high ground, so to speak. But we have to do it peacefully, non-violently. Just because we're right and they're wrong doesn't give us the right to violence. The age-old two wrongs don't make a right kind of concept. He was eventually released, and almost immediately the protests swelled again. While he was locked up, the protests began to die away because the leader of the protest wasn't there. Without King's charisma and presence, the protests began to kind of wane. When he got released, the protests were back in full force. And this time, Bull Connor unleashed everything he had. He unleashed his cops in full riot gear. They had shields, they had clubs, they had tear gas. They used attack dogs. They used fire hoses. There was a picture in your book, if you looked on page 877, where a man is getting hit in the small of the back by a fire hose at close range, and it's bending him in half. And again, the nation watched unarmed African Americans getting savagely attacked by police, and John F. Kennedy saw it as well. And Kennedy immediately ordered his aides to prepare a new civil rights bill. Now, it takes a few weeks to get a civil rights bill drafted, right? It takes a few weeks. And John F. Kennedy needed the right moment, right? He needed the right moment to introduce his bill. Because 3 weeks after the whole incident in Birmingham, the hoopla had died down, so to speak, right? The uproar. So he needs a new moment. he gets his new moment. He gets his new moment thanks to Roll Tide, the University of Alabama. Actually, he gets it thanks to Governor George Wallace. Some of you are going, sir, I remember that name. He ran in 1968. Yes, he did, as an independent segregationist. Um, Governor Wallace, governor of Alabama, George Wallace, was an outspoken segregationist who, at his inauguration to become governor of Alabama, once famously said, I draw a line in the dust and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. Clearly, he believes in segregation. On June 11th, 1963, um, Mr. Governor Wallace stood in front of the registrar's office door to prevent a couple of African Americans from registering to attend the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa. The reason why you might see Tom Hanks here in the background, if you've looked, this is a scene in the movie Forrest Gump. If you've ever seen the movie Forrest Gump, they parody this scene. Actually, they don't put Forrest Gump's head on this person. They make it to where like he's like looking over the shoulders and stuff, and then the lady drops her book. It's a great scene. And but yeah, so the entire country watched yet another governor say, nope, nope, can't go to school here. And federal marshals having to say yet again, you either let them go to school or we can arrest you on federal charges. And that's when John F. Kennedy decided now's the time. Now's the time that we need to present this, right? And so that very evening, he went on television and he spoke to the American people about a moral issue, as he termed it, that was as old as the scriptures and as clear as the American Constitution. And I quote, the heart of the question is whether we are going to treat our fellow Americans as we want to be treated. If an American, because his skin is dark, cannot eat lunch in a restaurant open to the public, if he cannot send his children to the best public school available, if he cannot vote for the public officials who will represent him, then who among us would be content to have the color of his skin changed and stand in his place? I mean, that's a very solid argument. You know, for some people, like, it's not that bad. It's no big deal. It's like, all right, trade places. You know, let's flip it around. Now, Dr. King realized Kennedy is going to face an uphill battle. Kennedy's a Democrat. He needs Southern support to get this passed, right? And so Dr. King decided, along with a few others, that a protest unlike any other was necessary, a demonstration unlike any other to bring attention. And thus was born the famed March on Washington. On August 28, 1963, over 200,000 people of all races came to our nation's capital, and they gathered in the National Mall here, around the reflecting pool, outside the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, and they heard speeches and sang songs. And it was here that King delivered perhaps his most famous address, his I Have a Dream speech, where he said, I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that my four little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last. That's the little bit of the speech that is always shown. That's like that little 30-second clip that everybody has heard or seen. Um, Now, you would think that after a rousing speech and protest like this, it'd be smooth sailing. You'd be wrong. If you don't know how American government works, it is not good at getting stuff done quickly. Um, the Civil Rights Bill was going to pass the House of Representatives probably pretty easily. There were a majority of Republicans, and if you added up the Republicans and Northern Democratic congressmen, you're good to go, right? There were enough Republicans and Northern Democratic congressmen to get the Civil Rights Bill through Congress, or through the House. It would be a lot harder in the Senate. It's not because you couldn't get a majority in the Senate. It's because the Senate has something that the House doesn't have. In the Senate, you can prevent a bill from being voted on. It's called a filibuster. You see, in the Senate, a senator is allowed to speak on a bill as long as they wish. They have the microphone as long as they want. And so it's a way of preventing a vote on a bill. You simply never get down from the podium. Now, that doesn't mean you have to actually be debating the bill. You can read from your grandma's cookbook if you want, which is what one Southern senator did. I mean, if you want to get up there and read the Dr. Seuss collection and then start hitting Harry Potter, you're allowed to, right? No one's going to tell you you can't. You're a United States senator. And so this was a tactic that had been used on and off in American history to kind of bend the will of the president or the public. Now, you can stop a filibuster. Back then, it took 67 votes. It took a two-thirds vote. It's called a vote of cloture. A vote of cloture means that we are ending debate and we are voting on the matter. And nowadays, you only need 60. We changed the rules for the vote of cloture, but in the 1960s, a vote of cloture required a two-thirds vote, 67 votes. Now you start doing the math and you're realizing, man, if you got all the Southern senators who don't want to have the vote of cloture, you only need a handful more to refuse to do it, right? Um, and many African Americans were afraid that their bill would never get passed because of this. And then John F. Kennedy was assassinated on November 22nd, 1963 in Dallas, Texas. And his vice president, Lyndon Johnson, became president of the United States. Um, Now, Lyndon Johnson had been the man who helped get the Civil Rights Bill of 1957 passed, and another one in 1960, which was a little bit weaker. But he, like I said, he got them passed by weakening them, by compromising, by making changes. And Lyndon Johnson's from Texas, which doesn't exactly sound like the kind of fellow who's going to be pro civil rights. If you just want to go off stereotypes, he's a Southerner. Truth be told, Lyndon Johnson was a humongous believer in civil rights. Lyndon Johnson, briefly, before he was in politics, was a teacher, and he taught at a lower income school. Most of his students were poor. A large chunk of them were minorities. And Lyndon Johnson said that he understood the pain and the struggle and the disadvantage and just how the children that he taught didn't have a chance. Their parents didn't have a chance. And it really stuck with him his whole career. And so Lyndon Johnson was a humongous believer in both education and civil rights because of that brief experience before he entered the realm of politics. And Lyndon Johnson was determined to get this passed. And unlike John F. Kennedy, who really had no knowledge of how to work Congress, Lyndon Johnson knew how to work Congress. Historians like to call it the Johnson treatment. Lyndon Johnson knew how to manipulate Congress. He knew which congressman he could bully. He knew which congressman he could manipulate. There were a ton of people who owed him favors, or owed him something from back in the past from something he did from them, right? He knew who he had IOUs on. He knew who he could intimidate. He knew the guys that were his buddies, where he could just walk in, pour a glass of whiskey, talk, garbage for 5 minutes before he walked out their office. Now vote on that bill for me. He knew how to work it. He knew that Congress, there's a lot of back scratching, there's a lot of favors, and he understood that game. He was a master craftsman at that. And what do you know? He was able to get it done. I'd also like to point out, he also turned the Civil Rights Act into a John F. Kennedy legacy thing, right? He knew how to guilt people too. This man fought for this, and he was murdered, violently in front of God and everybody, and we're going to get this done for him. This will be the last thing that John F. Kennedy ever did for America, right? And if you don't vote for it, then, you're a horrible person. And gentlemen, he was able to get a vote of cloture. After 87 days of debate and filibuster, he finally got a vote of cloture to end the filibuster. 71 to 29. He got 4 more votes than he needed for cloture, and that was the vote to pass the Civil Rights Act. And on July 2nd, 1964, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was written into law. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is the most important civil rights legislation ever enacted by the United States Congress. It gave the federal government the power to prevent racial discrimination basically all over America. It made segregation illegal in almost every public place you can imagine. It gave citizens of all races equal access to all facilities, basically. It gave the Attorney General more power to pursue lawsuits and court orders and injunctions to force school desegregation. It required private employers to end discrimination. It created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or the EEOC, to prevent discrimination in the workplace based on race, religion, gender, and any of those things. I mean, this was a massive, sweeping piece of legislation, not just for African Americans, for all Americans. Um, as I said, race, religion, gender. Some of the stuff that went into the Civil Rights Act guarantees that, no matter, um, if you're Catholic, if you're Protestant, if you're Jewish, if you're man, you're woman, that, it went beyond just race. Now, even after the Civil Rights Act was passed, though, you can't just go, oh, yeah, we're done. No, we're not done. The act had focused on ending segregation and job discrimination. It did not talk about voting. Now, I know some of you think we already talked about voting, sir. 1957 Civil Rights Act. Yeah. And the 24th Amendment to the United States Constitution, passed in 1964, eliminated poll taxes or fees for federal elections, basically making you pay to vote in a federal election. But African Americans still found it hard to vote. There had been efforts to, of course, increase voter registration in the South amongst African Americans, but it was struggling mightily. Um, and as I said, 1964, after the Civil Rights Act was passed, in June and between June and October of 1964, there were bombs and fires that destroyed 24 African American churches in Mississippi. This was that Mississippi burning I was talking about, right? 24 separate churches. I emphasize churches. Like I've said before in our class, you're twisted any way you slice it when you start blowing stuff up. But you're attacking a church, right? 24 of them. Clearly, we're not done, right? And Dr. King decided it was time to, bring attention to the lack of voting rights that were being upheld. And he figured the best place to do it was Selma, Alabama. Selma's population was a majority African American. The majority of the population of the town or small city, however you want to term it, of Selma, Alabama, was African American. Yet only 3% of the voters were African American, registered voters. So you've got a town. Here you go. In 2010, if you're wondering, in 2010, Selma was about 80% African American. Okay, so about 80% of the people in Selma in 2010 were African American, right? And I'm going to try and see if I can find out what the numbers were in 1960. I was hoping to wow you with a really specific statistic, and turns out I can't find that really specific statistic. I was able to find a lot of information in the 1960 census about Selma and Dallas County, which Selma is the county seat of Dallas County, but I could not find actual racial statistics in the census. So I guess we'll just have to go with the majority of the county was African American, but only 3% or so of the registered voters were African American. The reason for this, if you're wondering, is not because of a lack of civil rights laws, as we've already discussed. The Civil Rights Act of 1957 should have taken care of this. The problem is the local sheriff, Sheriff Jim Clark. Sheriff Jim Clark basically kept African Americans from voting. They were known to terrorize African Americans who did vote, and they basically kept people to not even think about trying to go vote. And here's an example of how you do it. Here's a method they would use. Sheriff Clark would deputize a bunch of people, right? Basically, like make them temporary officers around election time. And they would go to places where voting would be held, right? And they would be there to supposedly keep the peace, right? Supposedly prevent any problems at the polls. And they would see African Americans in line. And these police officers would go up and ask these people for their ID, ask them questions, and write down their name. and write down their address and things of that nature and kind of give you a look. And if you're an African American guy and this white police officer who is clearly not a fan of you standing in line to vote suddenly writes down your name and your address, are you going to go vote? I mean, remember, this is like 1950s, early 1960s Alabama. This is the same state where they firebombed the Freedom Riders in Anniston. This is the same state where you saw people get beat with billy clubs and attacked with police dogs in Birmingham. I mean, is voting that important? No. And so people were intimidated and scared out of voting because they basically understood that an African American voting in Selma, you were risking your life, quite honestly, right? Um, Dr. King, though, was determined. He was determined to bring attention. About 2,000 African Americans were arrested in Selma in the first week or so of protests that Dr. King staged in Selma. Um, Selma became national news, right? And again, it was the age-old pictures of the police officers attacking people in the streets. But Dr. King wouldn't stop. He said, "We got to keep the pressure on." And he announced that they were going to march from Selma to the state capital of Montgomery. It's about 50 miles. Selma is about 50 miles to the west of the state capital. And King said, "We're gonna walk from Selma to Montgomery to bring attention to voting rights here in Selma." Now, in order to get out of Selma to get to the state capital, you got to cross a little river on the edge of town, and to cross the river, you got to go over the Edmund Pettus Bridge on U.S. Highway 80. Well, the protesters began to get ready to, they're crossing over the bridge, and Sheriff Clark and a bunch of his deputies are on the other side, and basically blocking their path. And Sheriff Clark told the demonstrators, like, "Go home, clear out, disperse." Instead, Dr. King and about several hundred of the people that were with him, they stopped and they knelt down in prayer in the middle of the street, and they just began to pray. That's when Sheriff Clark ordered his state troopers and deputies to go in there, and with television cameras rolling, they attacked people knelt in prayer. And it was on tape. This is a photo from it. But with the media watching, police officers fired tear gas and began attacking people knelt in prayer. And the nation was stunned. The nation was shocked. 70 people had to be hospitalized. They were hurt so badly. President Johnson lost it. President Johnson was absolutely furious. 8 days later, he appeared on a national televised joint session of Congress and proposed a new set of voting laws, which became the Voting Rights Act of 1965. On August 3rd, 1965, the House of Representatives passed it by a wide margin. The very next day, August 4th, 1965, the Senate also passed it. The Voting Rights Act of 65 authorized the Attorney General to send federal examiners to register voters, meaning we're taking it out of the hands of local government, local officials, local sheriffs, etc. This kind of sounds reminiscent of how we fought the KKK, if you remember, way back in Reconstruction. We can't trust the local officials. We can't trust the local police, the local sheriff, the local whoever. And so we got to send it straight to the national level, right? Federal marshals, U.S. marshals, people from D.C. They will be in charge of voter registration. The law suspended all discriminatory tests, literacy tests or any of that sort of stuff. The results were dramatic. By the end of the year, 250,000 new African American voters had been registered. And if you look at the results long term, the number of African Americans elected in this country, there were only about 100 African Americans elected in the entire southern United States in 1965, at all levels. I'm talking city, county, state, federal. 100. There were thousands of positions, gentlemen, and I'm not making that up. Thousands of jobs that people could be elected to in the South. And only about 100 of them went to African Americans. And again, remember, there were a large number of parts of the South where the majority of the people are African American. If you look at it, by 1990, more than 5,000 African Americans were getting elected to elected office in the South, right? The Voting Rights Act of 1965 is considered a pivotal moment in the civil rights movement because basically the first two goals have been attained, if you think about it. The civil rights movement was focused early on fighting segregation and to secure voting rights. And by 1965, they had done it. They had secured it between the Civil Rights Act of 64 and Brown v. Board a decade earlier and the Voting Rights Act. The original goals of the civil rights movement had been achieved, legally speaking, right? And it looked like the government was fighting to enforce them. And that's why this is seen as the moment the Civil Rights Act changed, or the Civil Rights Movement, changed, or went into a new phase. After 65, the movement is going to be focused less on legal rights and more on social issues. In 29.3, you're going to see us discuss more about talking about how to deal with economic problems, equality issues just within society, not as much legal, because by this point, all the legal barriers have been knocked down. Now the issue is societal and economic, right? But again, that is a discussion for the next section.